We have 2 more occasional series this season that we hope that you'll come to. On April 16th, back in the 9th floor room that we usually use, we're going to be sponsoring an event with the probation department on intimate partner violence and its implications for community supervision. We're very excited that we'll also have, like we did with the children of incarcerated parents, event that we did at the beginning of the season, a bibliography to share with you about key research and what kind of findings it has to inform your work. And then on May 21st, we're going to do a whole morning on higher education and its potential related to reentry, featuring both a report that's just been released from the Center for Community Alternatives and one that my predecessor, Debbie Muckamal, co-authored that was just released on the potential for higher education in prisons in California. So we hope that you'll join us for both of those. So it is my distinct pleasure. Oh, the other thing that you are invited to is that we sponsor, as part of our Pinkerton Fellowship Initiative, we sponsor symposia on youth justice. And because we had a snow delay, we're doing both of them in the next 6 weeks. On Monday, we're sponsoring a symposia on youth development, what the research tells us. And then, what's the date for the second one? April 14th will be the second part of that, which is how you apply the theory of youth justice to the actual work that we do. So you can enroll in those through our website too. We hope you will. So without any further delay, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce my colleague, Kevin Barnsini, who is the Director of Research for the Prisoner Reentry Institute. Dr. Barnsini has been working with PRI for the last year on a range of projects. And in all of those projects has taken a particular focus on what does community mean and what can we learn by thinking about it perhaps in some new ways. So he was the perfect person to moderate today, and I'm just going to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning. So it's my pleasure to welcome our keynote speakers and panelists today. There's no need for me to go through lengthy introductions because we have the bios. On my very far left is Todd Clear, who's the Provost at Rutgers University-Newark. Next to him is Geert Dhondt, who's the Assistant Professor at John Jay College's Department of Economics. Then we have Kate Rubin, who's the Managing Director of the Civil Action Practice at Bronx Defenders. And then there's Julio Medina, who's the Executive Director and Founder and CEO of Exodus Transitional Community. Thanks, man. We're also waiting on Councilman Jermaine Williams. He represents the 45th Council District, which is parts of Flatbush, East Flatbush, Flatlands, and so on in Brooklyn. So I was asked to give a kind of framing at the very beginning to orient you to what Todd and Geert's research is. And this is quite challenging for me. One is because I'm speaking to a microphone. 2, I don't have PowerPoint slides that I can hide behind. And 3, I tend to like to walk around the room and wave my arms a lot. I've been told I have to try and be more professional, so I'll do my best. So today's topic is the consequences for communities of the growth of mass incarceration. I think it's important to spend a little bit of time trying to orientate ourselves to this topic. So often when we think about mass incarceration, we're thinking about the impact and the experience of incarceration on individuals. We talk about collateral consequences that individuals experience and the services and supports that an individual needs as he or she re-enters the community. But what Todd and Geert's research does is it shifts things out another level to a wider level. Instead, what they're asking is what is the impact of this continual cycling from community to prison and back again on communities? So they're asking what is the impact of this coercive mobility on the communities from which people are being taken? They provide a direct challenge to the view that incarceration makes communities safer because it takes people who threaten community safety off the streets. In this coercive mobility thesis, Todd argues that prison removals and returns damage the already weakened social fabrics of communities, which leads to increases in crime. But first, a few words on community. The term community is a very nebulous and shifting concept, and it means different things to different people. We can think of community as a historically and politically defined geography. It's the community of the 45th Council District, or we can talk about Community Board 11. This kind of community is a territorial community, it's a bounded community. We also may talk about territories which has ethnic enclaves within them. You hear people talking about Chinatown or Spanish Harlem. Or we might identify bounded areas where the people within that area largely share a similar socioeconomic status. So we might talk about the Lower East Side or the Upper West Side. But for other people, the term community is they're really talking about a set of relationships and a set of networks that exist between organizations and institutions within that community and across other communities. They're talking about the interrelationships between businesses, between churches, schools, colleges, law enforcement, and of course, families. At times, these affiliations and relationships, they actually transcend fixed geographic boundaries. We talk about the immigrant community, we talk about the gay and lesbian community, or the blogging community. And we often use this word interchangeably with the word neighborhood. And proxy for community is often neighborhood, and neighborhood when we're talking about community. We talk about community engagement through neighborhood opportunity networks. Of course, neighborhoods are smaller territorial spaces. Neighborhoods have been described as the building blocks of community, and they help to reflect social solidarities and patterns of self-help. Some scholars talk about the psychic commitment that exists within neighborhoods, which are fostered by that geographic proximity. But I think it's important to note that we mustn't paint the picture of community as too rosy. As Jock Young would always say, communities exclude during the process of inclusion. By identifying who we are, we're clearly defining who is not part of us, who is an outsider, who is the other. And we certainly need to be careful of falling into the trap of seeing community as the panacea to every social problem. But equally, we need to be careful when we talk about communities as disadvantaged or deprived or toxic communities. For many of the people living in communities, they talk about love, family, friendships, relationships. So what do we know about mass incarceration in communities? We know that incarceration is concentrated in a small number of communities, typically urban neighborhoods. The problem we face, though, is that very few studies have actually managed to isolate the effect of incarceration on those very communities. And those that we do have aren't very strong studies. This is a problem because when we try to do research, what we really want to do is isolate the effect of the impact of incarceration on communities. We want to understand what that continual cycling back and forth from community to prison, to community corrections, back to prison again, and then back to community supervision again, what that coercive mobility does, how it manages to damage local network structures, undermines informal social control. But to research this, we hit a number of big problems, because mass incarceration is entangled with social disadvantage. It's hard to isolate that mass incarceration from the impact of poverty, violence, social inequality. It's hard to capture, therefore, the magnitude of mass incarceration and prison cycling when it's embedded in social disadvantage. But what we do know is that incarceration is concentrated in communities that are already severely disadvantaged, and that those least capable of absorbing the additional adversities brought on by incarceration. And this is why Todd and Geert's research is so important. It's an important step in giving us some nuance. Mass incarceration impacts different communities differently. And when we're armed with this nuance, we can begin to identify strategies and policies that can really help individuals, neighborhoods, and communities. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Todd.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks, Ann, for asking us to do this. I hope we stimulate some thinking and maybe some ideas about strategies. Let me start by saying how happy I am to be back at John Jay. I was a professor here for more than a decade, and this building hadn't been built yet, and it really is spectacular what's happened to this place in the few years that I've been gone, and I always love coming back, so I'm glad to be back, and I'm glad to be asked to do this. I'm going to set the stage for the results of a study that lasted, I think we spent almost 3 years on this work, maybe a little bit more. And Geert will talk about the actual statistical results, partly because he's an economist and understands numbers probably better than I do, but also because he was mainly involved in producing those numbers. The title of the talk is The Growth of Incarceration in the United States, Consequences for Communities. There are a host of consequences for communities of the large number of people going in and out of prisons who live there, as Kevin alluded to. And we're only going to talk about one, and that's crime. And crime is particularly important because, at least theoretically, one of the reasons we're locking all these people up and then returning them back with all the processes that go on is that it has something to do with our concern about crime. And so we're going to talk about really one of the main consequences, but I don't want to suggest that that's the most important one for us to think about, and there are lots of other consequences. People are writing books about them now for children, for spouses, for neighborhoods, for economics, and so on. We're just going to talk about crime. And I'll give you the bottom line. We started out with the belief that incarceration matters for communities and crime, and we will talk more about that. And we made an argument in receiving the grant to do this research that incarceration matters in ways that are not intuitive. The answer to the question, what did you learn, is that we learned, yes, we were right, but we also learned that places matter. The characteristics of the places where incarceration occurs also matter, and places aren't all identical. So now you know what the conclusion is. Let me fill in all the blanks to the end. But I don't know if you watched Downton Abbey, but I'm wanting to know what the conclusion is there too. So it's remarkable to me how much the story. By the way, this is the grant that we received to be able to do this work. Was called "Predicting Crime Through Incarceration: The Impact of Rates of Prison Cycling on Rates of Crime in Communities." And it's important that you see that title because it gives an illustration of how much the story has changed just in the last few years. So the solicitation that NIJ put out, that we got this grant for, was a solicitation to do predictions of crime rates. And the idea was that people would look at uniform crime reports or demographic changes or whatever, and try to use them to show predictions of crime rates. And when they got this proposal from us, they were shocked. They didn't think that you would want to think of incarceration as giving you some basis for predicting crime rates. The reason why that's important is that they never, even though prison rates had been growing for over 40 years in the United States, there had never been a study of the impact of that on anything funded by the federal government. And the only way you can get grant money to study the growth of incarceration for years, for 3 decades, was to frame your research question even though everybody knew that the biggest story in town was the growing prison population, was to frame your research question inside some other question. So the original research that we did in Tallahassee was a part of a drug solicitation. What are the kinds of policies that affect drug rates in communities? And we wanted to look at incarceration as one of those policies. So today, and I think your president, Jeremy Travis, has been an important part of this, today the entire conversation has changed. Somebody was telling me, it was Andrew Farman, Andrew was telling me, who was it? Bernie Carrick now is against mass incarceration? Of course, you know why. But so is, so are the co-workers, right? So the conversation is, we're in the middle of such enormously shifting sands. And so this study starts out as can we sneak in some research on communities while the other research apparatus is going on? It comes out the other end saying, we have something important to say about something that everybody is currently talking about. Geert put this in there. I think it's self-explanatory. There is a certain quality to which there's an impersonalization of a processing of lots of people through a prison system. And that is really what we're talking about. This is the macro picture, the red or whatever, close to red. Somebody knows a better name for that color probably than I do. The red line is crime rates, the blue line is incarceration rates. I could say an awful lot about this, but I'll say two things because we want to give time for a discussion. One is, you can see that the crime rate precedes the incarceration rate, doesn't follow it, right? There's this huge growth, and it's really decades later that incarceration starts catching up. And you'll see that the crime rate starts falling at about the same time that the incarceration rate starts declining. And so, and the other point I'll make is that you can pull out any 7-year period there and make any argument you want to make about the relationship between incarceration and crime. You want to say incarceration is associated with crime going up. There are several different 7-year periods that make that. Incarceration is associated with crime going down. There are also 7-year periods. And if you want to say there's no relationship, there are 7-year periods there. So whatever argument you want to make about the relationship between incarceration and crime, that graph will enable you to make. So what about predicting crime rates through incarceration? So traditionally, and the common sense view is that if you lock somebody up, you prevent crime. They can't commit crimes. I'm not going to talk a lot about what's wrong with that view because the incapacitation argument that's generally used is simplistic. Just because Joe is in prison and therefore cannot commit crimes doesn't mean the crimes Joe would have been involved in had Joe been out are no longer being committed, right? So there's lots of, and that's particularly true for drug-related crime. If you lock up a person for a drug crime, you create a job opening in the community. But there's an alternative view, and this is the one that we explored, that something happens when you have large numbers of people cycling in and out of the prison system in a community to that community. And it's not about deterrence or incapacitation. It's about really what happens. So the traditional views say, these are the factors that affect crime rates. You incapacitate people. People go to prison, they get rehabilitated. We know that those rates are low. Retribution somehow creates a more just society, or the presence of crime rates deters people. So these are the general arguments that are made. But in a paper that I published in the 80s, entitled Backfire, which ironically was published in the Oklahoma Journal of Correctional Research, which had, I think, 2 issues, and then was closed down. But for a long time, when you Googled me, this was the thing that came up because it passed around. It was one of those things, because it was a counterintuitive argument. There are lots of ways in which we can think that prison growth could produce more crime, right? So if people come out of prison, for example, less able to live crime-free lives, and you put a lot of people in that experiment, you're actually producing more people who are more likely to engage in crime. Community level effects that have been explored. So just give you one example. We know that going to prison reduces economic activity of an individual over the lifetime of 40%. So if you have a neighborhood where everybody's been to prison, you have a neighborhood where everybody has 40% less economic activity. And if that's the neighborhood, then the kids who live there, the adults who live there, the businesses that are trying to thrive there, all those things have more trouble being vibrant. And in places where there's no vibrant economic activity, what do you get? You get more crime. Our particular thesis was around coercive mobility. One of the things that we know that is associated with crime rates is neighborhood level instability. And instability is generally measured as the number of people who are moving in and out of that neighborhood. And when you have a lot of people being moved in and out of the neighborhood because they're being sent to prison and then returned, what you have is what we coined as coercive mobility. Dina Rose and I writing back. And the last point I'll make is that it's about stock and flow. So we often think about crime rates in terms of the stock population of people who are incarcerated. So for example, right now, there are almost 6 times more people incarcerated than there were in 1980. So, and if I said to you today, in the next 30 years, we're going to lock up 6 times more people, and I'd say, what do you think? You'd say, well, we can't afford it. But then you'd also say, but there'll be no crime. The truth is, we have the same crime rate we had in 1976 with almost 8 times as many people incarcerated. So if I told you in 72, we're going to increase the number of prisoners by 8-fold, but we're going to get the same crime rate when we're done, you'd have said, bad deal. I want out of that deal. But the flow is also more important. So, for example, almost 1 million people go in and out of prison every year. 7 or 8 or 9 million go in and out of jails every year. So it's not just the number of people who are currently incarcerated on any given day, but it's the number of people who are experiencing this process. And at the neighborhood level, that's what produces the instability that we're talking about. So the guiding thesis of this work is that the effect of the stop population of prisoners on reducing crime is overcome by counteracted by the effects of the instability in that neighborhood that are produced by large rates of people coming back and being removed. Obviously, a large number of people returning from prison produces instability in that neighborhood to absorb people, but also the large number of people being removed also produces instability. Every family loses a family member, the economic activity that person produced is gone, and on and on and on. So the hypothesis of our work is, what is the positive effect of, by positive that means making crime rates go up, that doesn't mean good. What is the impact on crime rates of releases? What is the impact of crime rates on crime rates of admissions? And how are those affected by the level of concentrated disadvantage? So in Tallahassee, in our original Tallahassee research, Dina Rose and I found in 2003, found a tipping point. That when neighborhoods reach a certain level of disadvantage, the flow of people in and out, when the flow of people in and out of a prison, this is important, when the flow of people in and out of a prison, of a neighborhood to and from the prison system reached a certain point, crime rates started to increase. So there was a tipping point of the effect on the neighborhoods. And that's important because I think our research adds to that.
The study that we did I believe it took 5 years.
5 years.
Was to try to estimate the kind of impact of crime, of prison cycling on crime rates in communities. So the first thing we had to do was we had to build a data set, and the first thing we had to do before that was to get the data. That's a whole different story. I have fond memories of driving with Todd to the Camden Police Department and the Trenton Police Department, and well, luckily in Trenton, the only crime you can do is a type 1 crime. They don't keep data on other different things. So there was all kinds of funny stories about many of these police departments have no idea about any crime data and so on. So and not really collected very well. So originally we wanted to go back to 1980. This was quickly reconsidered with the quality of the data that we had. So there was all kinds of challenges with these different things, and so certain cities like Camden we could not use at all. Was going to be impossible to get the data from them. So but the first thing we had to build these data sets. So for most places that we ended up with, Newark, Trenton, rural New Jersey, where we got data from the state police, and Boston, we got data from the police, but we also got data from the correctional facilities for when, so the data set is built on where people live when they enter prison and where people go to when they leave prison. And plus then we can control for all those characteristics of census tracts within those particular census tracts based on census data. So what we try to do was just we try to just model that kind of impact. So the first thing I want to show, the great people at like Eric Cadora built a series of maps. So this is a map of 3 places: Boston, Newark, and Trenton. Boston on the left, Newark in the center, and Trenton on the right. And if you look at this map, it might be hard to read, but it is the crime rates per 1,000 residents, and you can see that the red areas are the high places of crime, and the greener areas are less crime. So you can see the variation between them. Here's a map of prison admissions, and if you go look at again at the crime rates and the prison admissions, there is some overlap, but also significant differences, right? So where the crime happens is not necessarily where the prisoners come from. And then this is an index about concentrated disadvantage. So as you can see, there's a lot more just from the map overlap between concentrated disadvantage and prison admissions than prison admissions and crime. So here are some basic correlations between for Boston. So what the number I would like you to look at is the concentrated disadvantage, which is the last line from the bottom up, and you can see the how concentrated disadvantage is related to crime rates, which is a correlation of 0.15, and you can see later on that it's a correlation of 0.4 with admissions. Right? That's a similar thing, different way to look at it from the same stuff from the maps. Right? That, and if you would look at, this is from Tallahassee data. If you look at the correlations, this is from prison admissions only. You can, and this is the, instead of the concentrated advantage, this is divided with the different kind of components that might be relevant. You can see that prison admissions is highly correlated with percent black, but not with crime. So what that means is, right, neighborhoods which are highly black go to prison, but not, that's not where the crime happens. Or not, the crime in Tallahassee is in black neighborhoods is slightly higher, but the prison, it's about, if I remember correctly, about 1.5 times higher or so in black neighborhoods, but the admission rates are about 9 times higher. So here are some baseline regressions that we have for Boston, Newark, and Trenton, but let me go over to the regressions for Boston, and I don't know if you can read any of these different things. Don't worry, the next one will be even worse. But what we did is the kind of baseline regression for Boston, and we added cycling, and then we have a full for all the neighborhoods. Then we look at the regressions for the neighborhoods to the bottom 99% or the bottom 95%, and then we also have low disadvantage and high disadvantage. So as you can see in Boston, there is significant cycling and a positive effect on crime rates from prison cycling, especially in high disadvantaged neighborhoods. Here are the similar regressions for Tallahassee, and this is probably even harder to see, but as you can see, the sign will switch the sign will switch where in high disadvantaged neighborhoods or high black neighborhoods or high mothers with female-headed households or education, right? Neighborhoods with with lots of where lots of people live that don't have a high school diploma, right? In all those areas, there's a very strong correlation between or impact of cycling on crime rates, and this is where in other neighborhoods this is not there's no impact. This is for the high and low disadvantaged neighborhoods for Boston and Newark. So as you can see, for Boston, for example, when there is low disadvantage, there's a negative impact, a negative relationship. But for high, there's a positive relationship. What that means is that, right, where there's not much, in neighborhoods in Boston where there's not much disadvantage, that means that it's not statistically significant, but there's a negative relationship between prison cycling and crime rates. So what that means is that actually, there's no high concentrated advantage. The prison releases and admissions and the prison cycling, right, has a negative impact on crime. That means that if in neighborhoods with no concentrated advantage, people that go to prison lowers crime rates, but with high disadvantages increases crime rates. So for Newark, we do not find this the case, and in Newark, for some reason, unlike Tallahassee or Trenton, we find a negative relationship and not a positive relationship. So for conclusion from this all this work, we find very strong evidence for the coercive mobility thesis, right? Where when incarceration backfires in places like Tallahassee, Boston, and Trenton. So an increase in incarceration leads to an increase in crime in these particular cities. And that is only for places where there's for disadvantaged neighborhoods, but not for other neighborhoods. But in this thesis does not hold in Newark. So we've been trying to figure out why is this the case. So there might be some theoretical reasons and some empirical reasons. So the theoretical reasons is there's a very high degree of concentrated disadvantage, and in Newark, we'll go back to that later in a second. So we also thought, well, if there's a tipping point, right, when at some point when massive amounts of prison cycling, well, will increase crime, destabilizing the neighborhood, is there also saturation points, right, where at some point these things don't matter anymore. So I'm gonna just take a look at the following couple graphs. This first one is just the regular basic data from Boston, Newark, and Trenton. And if you can see it, the Trenton and the Boston are more similar in some ways than the Newark one. But this is a better way to look at it. So on the top left-hand side, I might have to go over there. You'll see. The order. So one is concentrated disadvantage. That's the index for on the left top is a concentrated disadvantage, right? Then there is on the one next to it is percent black. In the left-hand corner is poverty rates, and on the right-hand corner is median income. So this is the distribution of neighborhoods between these different places. If you look at a little line within the box, you can see that Newark, right, is you can see that the difference between on the left hand one in each panel there's three boxes. So the one is Boston, then the middle one is Newark, and the right one is Trenton. And so you can see that concentrated disadvantage in Boston, right? Even the top neighborhoods, right in or let's look at the right bottom corner first of median income and poverty. What you can see is that Newark is just a very poor city overall. There are no neighborhoods like Boston or Trenton where there's a lot of variation between the neighborhoods. Right, the top corner, right, in the top right-hand side is percent black, right, which is one of the most in all the research and all the data sets from all the different cities. Percent black in neighborhoods is what drives incarceration, and so what you can see is that right there is Newark is over 80% black, right, and even the most black neighborhoods in Boston, right, are less black than the lowest black neighborhoods in Newark, right, and the same thing goes for the median income and so on, or the poverty rate and the concentrated disadvantage. So in conclusion, right, it's important based on these various research in these various cities on the effects on on these different neighborhoods, that we should try to think about reconsidering this relationship between incarceration and crime, and that we should move away from thinking that right in places where there's lots of incarceration happening, right, this is very important depending on the place it's from. We should reconsider the relationship, and it does not necessarily lower crime rates, but instead increases crime rates. Oops, it's time to stop. So, right, have we reached a tipping point? right? Or the results support the crime increasing effects of incarceration, right? And we should be very careful to rely on incarceration as an all-encompassing solution to other kind of social problems.
Thank you, Todd and Geert. So what's going to happen now is that each of our panelists is going to give a short response, considering the issues that Todd and Geert raised. Then we'll have plenty of time for me to ask some questions, and we'll open it up to the audience to ask any questions that you have of any of the panelists. So first, I'm turning to Kate.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here in such excellent company, so thanks for inviting me. I manage the civil action practice at the Bronx Defenders, and just to say very quickly what we do at the Bronx Defenders is provide holistic, client-centered criminal defense, family defense, civil legal services, social work support, and advocacy for low-income people in the Bronx. We represent more than 35,000 people each year. We reach a lot more people through Know Your Rights trainings and outreach, and we work in interdisciplinary teams so that every client has seamless access to services to meet the needs that they identify for themselves. The primary goal of our model is to address the underlying issues that drive people into the criminal justice system and then mitigate the devastating impact of arrest, which include deportation, eviction, loss of employment, student loans, public benefits, removal of children from the home, probably a list you folks are familiar with. And we don't refer to those outcomes as collateral consequences. We use the term enmeshed penalties, which we think those consequences are not collateral at all, and that enmeshed penalties sort of better reflects the really serious risks and realities that our clients face in the criminal justice system. So I'll get back to those enmeshed penalties in a minute, but I want to just first confess that I'm totally provincial, and all I could think looking at this is what would the results be for the Bronx? Which I think speaks to what a valuable frame the paper and the presentation creates for thinking in a more nuanced way about mass incarceration in communities and how those two things interact. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you, the Bronx is a borough with high concentrations of disadvantage. So my guess would be that it'll look a lot more similar to Newark than to Trenton or Boston, even though there's, of course, lots of vibrancy in the Bronx and lots of amazing communities and lots of strength. There's also a lot of concentrated disadvantage. And I have to say that data from Newark is scary because I fear that if it's sort of in the wrong hands, twisted in the wrong way, it can be used to argue that in communities that have the most disadvantage, incarceration might be the best or the only or some kind of good option for keeping crime down, which I think is not at all what the authors say and not at all a conclusion that I take from it, but sort of could be twisted that way. I think what the data actually show really compellingly is that it's, and as Geert was just saying, is that it's not crime, but it's disadvantage that's driving incarceration. It's racism and economic disadvantage. And also, I think what the findings illustrate and what the authors have really elevated is the absolute importance of neighborhood stability. And I'm not a social scientist, so I don't know whether it would be fruitful or feasible, but one of the questions that I had was what that prison cycling relationship would look like if you looked at actually jail cycling. So instead of long-term stays and sort of the effects of that, what are the effects of short-term stays, couple days, couple weeks, couple months in county jails, and even just of sort of coming in and out of the really local criminal justice system. But whichever way we look at crime and neighborhood stability, one of the questions I think that the findings raised that's really basic is, what can we do to strengthen neighborhoods with high concentrations of disadvantage without displacing residents as we strengthen those neighborhoods into other neighborhoods with high concentrations of disadvantage, which is one of the problems we've had in New York. And so, and I think when we're answering that question, I come from a legal services office, but I think when we're answering that question, there's a little bit of a trap of thinking that what communities need is just more services, more evidence-based services. And communities definitely need services. Like, I spend basically all my time going around trying to raise money for legal services in the Bronx. But I think that there's more to it, and that communities need political power and economic investment and real self-determination. And we try to sort of work towards that at Bronx Defenders by, as well as legal services, doing community organizing and partnering with community-based organizations and grassroots groups. But I think there's sort of a huge amount more work to do. And just to make a plug, there's this great piece that Vesla Weaver did on the Marshall Project website just last week about a person I'd never heard of, Robert Woodson, who's a conservative black activist from Philadelphia in the 70s, who believed that it would be mediating structures in communities, like churches, community organizations, and families, that had to be mobilized to combat crime. And he testified before Congress in 1973, arguing that the Law Enforcement Assisted Administration, which had just been formed, had to fund grassroots organizations in low-income communities, and especially in communities of color, and his plea totally fell on deaf ears. And nearly all of that money went to police departments, to put more police on the streets, and to buy basically more equipment for policing. And he was undeterred and spent most of the 70s trying to change that course, and he teamed up with John Conyers, and he worked with the Congressional Black Caucus, and they didn't succeed. And the conclusion of Weaver's piece, I think, speaks directly to the findings here, which was that in the 70s, the crime debate was basically a contest between informal and formal social control. Formal social control, incarceration, supervision, won, big time. And finally, after 30 years, we're realizing what a huge mistake that was, and we're sort of trying to crawl our way back to strategies that actually strengthen and support community institutions that are crucial to containing crime. So that brings me back to enmeshed penalties, because something else was happening in that 30 or 40-year period while mass incarceration was expanding and that incarceration line was going up, which is that local, state, and federal governments were passing dozens and dozens of ordinances and regulations creating civil penalties for arrests and convictions in almost every venue: housing, employment, immigration, public benefits, you know the list. And those policies are really important, I think, in this conversation, because they cut directly at the most important institutions for stabilizing communities and people, which are families. Those are the punishments, I think, in large part, that have punished families when people get arrested and go to prison or jail. And some of those most severe policies, just in the past 10 years, while there's been more attention to them, have been chipped away at. But for the most part, we're still living with almost all of them. The chipping away has been really small. So I'll give a couple short examples from our work at Bronx Defenders, and then I will not take up more time. But we have a client who I'll call Mr. Lugo, who is a really active, involved father of 4 young children. His wife has serious medical condition, and she relies on Mr. Lugo for help with the children, but he can't live with his family because they live in public housing. And many, many years ago, more than 2 decades ago, he was convicted of a serious felony offense, and he served his time, and he came home, and he has 3 kids, and he's a great father, and he can't live with his family. And we have another client who I'll call Mr. Bryant, who's in a really similar situation. He is barred from living with the mother of his 3 children because of a drug conviction. And in their situation, one morning last year, he'd worked all night. He works as a merchandise loader. He'd done a night shift. The next morning, he picked up his 6-year-old daughter, brought her to the doctor, brought her home to her mother's NYCHA apartment, dropped her off. Mom was at work. Mom's brother was there, let Mr. Bryant in. He came in. He was exhausted. He'd worked all night, taken his daughter to the doctor. He lay down, took a nap, and that day, inspectors from the Housing Authority came to the apartment, found him there, and based on the one time that they found him in that apartment, have started termination proceedings against the whole family, kicking the whole family out of the apartment, which are ongoing right now. And those housing issues are only the beginning. So, we work with people who can't get security guard licenses, taxi licenses, home health aid licenses because of convictions. We've worked with people who get certificates of relief from disabilities, which are supposed to overcome licensing bars and create employment opportunities. They still can't find jobs, or they find jobs, and I hear this a lot, find entry-level jobs, and decades go by, and there's no upward mobility. can't get promotions because of the background checks, right? And the last thing I'll just say is that, because this is sort of an issue that we're doing a lot more work on, is civil forfeiture laws, which have been getting more attention nationally, and in New York our laws are not as egregious as in some places. But what they essentially do is function to take money and property out of the pockets of some of the poorest people in the city before they're convicted of any crime. So we represent a woman named Miss Cologne, who last time, right around this time last year, was stopped by the police with her boyfriend. She had $2,599 in her purse. She was arrested for prostitution. In her purse, she also had documents proving that $2,599 was the exact amount of her tax return, which she'd gotten that day and cashed. She was still arrested. Her case was dismissed in the next court date. And it took 6 months and tons of hurdles to jump through before we finally helped her get the money back. And that was with 2 attorneys and a paralegal working on her case. 6 months, and she didn't get it back until she'd missed 2 rent checks and started eviction, and had eviction proceedings started against her. So I think, as these stories illustrate, it's not just prison that has destabilizing effects on families and communities. And one of the conclusions in the paper that I really appreciated is that it was the sort of the focus at the end about policing, that we don't just need to change our sentencing policies, we need to change our policing policies, because it's really any interaction at all with the criminal justice system that can kind of trigger all of these really destabilizing effects for families and communities.
Thank you, Kate. And so next we turn to Julio.
Good morning, everyone. You see me shaking my head here. It's hard to digest some of the information that we get. Let me begin by saying, as we all know, and I think Todd concluded too, that prison as a crime prevention strategy just doesn't work. I think we all agree on that, and we have to find better alternatives. You know, it's limited in its scope and serves no rehabilitative purpose from my standpoint. So again, I want to just thank all of you for being here this morning. My name is Julio. I run a not-for-profit in East Harlem. It's called Exodus Transitional Community. We work with women and men being released from prison, as well as young people ages of 16 to 24 who are on probation. We also have sites in Newburgh and Poughkeepsie, so when I hear about the blight of poverty, it hits home, because each one of our sites are located in the poorest areas in those communities. Let me just begin by when we talk about mass incarceration and the impact of communities. Our communities have been compromised for so long already, and I want to make sure that we understand how fragile they are before we get to the next step of now this cycling process of men being brought out of these fragile communities, being locked away 300-400 miles from their families, and then brought back to the communities with those very limited resources that are there as well. So I want to kind of bring it home when we talk about our communities. And prior to incarceration, there were failing schools, the zero tolerance policy around broken windows, which basically says we could stop and search and frisk any young black or Latino man that we see, who we think are quote-unquote criminals, but we perceive, doesn't matter who you are, if you got a backpack or your pants are sagging, you fall under that suspect. So we are talking about communities already that many men, we see 1 out of every 6 men being incarcerated. Brooklyn has some of the highest rates, South Bronx as well, having some of those highest rates. So as we're looking at this, just the arrest rate, understand also our police contact daily of leaving your NYCHA development project and going to the store and then being stopped on the way to the store. And so this level of distrust that now develops when women and men are released from prison, it magnifies itself. So when you take all this into consideration, and we want to talk about this perception of this new reality, right? That's formed once someone is released from prison, when we talk about mass incarceration, and I want to speak again from the view of the community. Our offices, as I mentioned, are in the community. So I want to just provide some real examples of people that experience kind of deprivation daily and still try to figure out a way on how to navigate a system that's structured for failure. And Michelle Alexander speaks about that very eloquently, as you all know, when we talk about these structures. You know, for me, and I heard somebody mention the Koch brothers and now this whole conservative movement. And, you know, and it's great, whatever could get you to the table, if it's financial, fine. However, that's short-sighted if we don't have a long strategy in place. Right? We'll be revisiting this same conversation 20 years from now if long-term solutions kind of aren't developed. I mean, so it's great that, you know, there's this rumbling of, you know, how do we dwindle the crime rates? What do we do with prisons? It's just costing us too much. But the reality, it may be short-sighted, and it's important that, again, we think about some long-term strategies. And those strategies come from a couple of places. But let me give you a quick example of a conversation I overheard. When we talk about the impact of prison on families, on children, and it kind of blew me away. And so I go to pick up my niece. She's in the second grade, South Bronx, Ogden Avenue, in school. And I go pick her up, and she's online, second grader, talking to another second grader. And it's like, where's your dad? Oh, he's in a big castle. It's all the way upstate. Really? Yeah, and there's a lot of guards around. And I'm like, okay. And the other girl, oh, well, my dad is in prison. And she's like, wow, what's he in prison for? For stealing a refrigerator. And as I sat and overheard this conversation of two 8-year-olds accepting the fact that prison is a norm, is part of a normal conversation, you know, we begin to look at how it's become acceptable in some of our communities. And I think, Todd, you point that out in one of the areas where we talked about how incarceration has reduced this punitive effect, right? When we see those high concentrations coming from same neighborhoods, kind of it just being this cycling that we talked about. You know, I spent 12 years in prison, and I think for me it hits home when, and I love research, but I like talking about real lives. I like talking about the lives of what a felony does past the sentence. How we're totally blocked out of housing, how we're totally blocked out of any voting rights, how we totally cannot sit on juries, how when we talk about NYCHA, we're working with them to try to get them to open up a perspective, and they got one of our people in NYCHA, by the way, right now, so I don't want to totally, but those consequences that continually happen after prison. I had a gentleman in my office, 29 years yesterday, served 29 years. He's been out a year, working hard to find him a job. Working so hard to find him a job. Got him something, got his license, his culinary license. We got him Ronald as a cook. And got him the job. He did 2 weeks of training, sat there, and great. Been on the job 3 months. Gets calls by HR on Tuesday. So we see your criminal history, and we see you have multiple felonies. Doing excellent on the job. He said, yeah, it's 30 years ago. This is who I am today. And I need this job. I have nothing. I need this job. He confided to the HR people, I live in a shelter. I need this job. I'm saving for my apartment, which is his goal. I mean, I got 20 letters from him when he was inside talking about this apartment that he's going to get when he gets out. And he's waiting for HR's decision, and in the meantime, It is, don't come back to work as of this day, so we know what the results are going to be. We don't want you back. And this is daily. This isn't an isolated incident that I'm talking about. I mean, these consequences happen daily to our population. And I just think it's important as we talk about mass incarceration, as we begin to talk about solutions to mass incarceration, that we really, and all of us, like, take this opportunity to look and say, what can we do today, and not leave here with our minds, oh, wow, that was great talk. I love what he's had to say. What can we do today to begin this mobilization process where there's going to be some equitable justice when someone comes home from prison? Because as we talk about repairing our communities, we're talking about repairing, men and women that are in 53,000 men and women in New York State that are inside, that live in conditions that are. I mean, you heard the Rikers Island. Many of you heard about Rikers Island. Some of you maybe followed the most recent story of the 3 correctional officers in Attica that charged with a misdemeanor, keep their pensions, but yet this brother, they knocked out his eye socket. Not an isolated incident. Not an isolated incident at all. So coming home with this trauma and trying to fit back into the fabric of our communities, we're saying we need everyone's help. This isn't a place where we can say, well, we have a peace and we need everyone's help. And I think that's the crucial part of my reading and listening to Todd and listening to some of the things that you talked about. It's clearly a criminalization of the poor. It's clearly we have to find and develop different strategies that are going to help and be effective. And most importantly, that there be a fairness, that someone with a felony conviction be able to compete. We just want to compete. I'm not asking to jump ahead of the line. All right? I'm just asking to just allow me to compete in the employment market. And I think if we begin to strategize and put some of these things together, I think we can at least begin to solve some of the problems that exist within our community. So, thank you, buddy.
Thank you. Okay. And I'm very pleased to welcome Jermaine Williams to speak next.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
How are you? Wake up.
That's it.
Thank you for having me here today. Esteemed panel. I'm proud to be here. I'm sure much more expert than I on this. My name is Jermaine Williams, council member for the 45th District in the City Council. These issues have always been. You can't hear me? Oh, can you hear me? Oh, I see. I got a big mouth. These issues have always been have been big to me, and I'll try to talk briefly because I like to get to the questions and what have you. But one, I just wanted to point out that we have a tendency to prejudge people's beliefs and their code of ethics and what have you, and it's always funny to me. And there was an article you might see today of an inmate who saved a corrections officer, and his ethos said that you don't violate women. You just don't do that. And you might have been surprised to hear that, but I know people who would probably be called a criminal in my life that I would trust with my life more than some of the upstanding elected officials I work with every single day.
It's a low bar.
You said it's a low bar? But I want to start more from macro because obviously the United States likes to tout the freedoms that we have, which a lot of them are true. But obviously we have some of the highest incarceration rates in the world. We're at, I think, about a little over 700 per 100,000. Russia is over 400 per 100,000. Rwanda is almost 500 per 100,000. India is at 30 per 100,000. They actually probably need to arrest some more people, but that's another story. But I say that to say we're not doing too well in a lot of ways. And I like to back up because for framework purposes, I always say that I feel like the country is working the way the country was designed to work. So from inception, the people who are supposed to benefit are rich white males. And so it's always amazing to me that people are shocked when the people who are benefiting are rich white males. And I say that because for me it's just a matter of fact that I like to say so that we can move forward in discussion, but people always get stuck in that. Well, how can you say it? And I don't understand. That's just what it is. Condoleezza Rice, I was watching something, she mentioned the birth defect of slavery. And so if that is true, I don't see how we expect that birth defect to just disappear so quickly, especially when we won't even admit that the birth defect has a major problem into the way that we're feeling now. So when it deals with criminal justice, it's just a furtherance of the birth defect. It's just based and rooted in the way this system is set up to be. You have people alive today who remember not being able to vote. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, I don't know if people can really understand that. They were not allowed to vote. That was 50, 60 years ago. That's just like right now. And I always think all of these things are always connected, of course, because any statistic you look at, it's way too hard to be black in America. Just any statistic that you look at, whether it's education, whether it's unemployment, whether it's the incarceration rate. Per capita, I think it's over 2,000 per 100,000. White, it's 300 per 100,000. So it's a terrible system, and it's hard to fix if we don't admit those facts. And people get stuck on those facts, and I'm not stuck on it. It's just that's what it is, and we can't fix it if you won't even acknowledge that that's where we are. That this is rooted in racist thinking, it's rooted in prejudicial thinking. And I heard Kate mentioning that, you know, the tough on crime policy won. It won because of who was perceived to feel the heat of all of that. If there were different communities perceived to feel the heat of all that, then it wouldn't have won. But it was, we're locking up those brutes and those people who are evil by nature. And so we're going to lock them up as long as we can, and that's the solution. But if we look back in history of this country, decades and decades ago, people may have seen Leonardo DiCaprio in Gangs of New York. There were people who came to the country from other places that had lighter melanin in their skin and did vicious things. They shot police officers, young people running around doing craziness. And the social elite at that time said these folks need upward mobility. They need jobs, they need education. So they crafted and designed programs to send to those communities that would offer them jobs and better education. And when the violence and the crime changed, because it wasn't always black and brown men shooting each other, when it began to change who was doing it, people then said these folks are victims of their own self-destruction. And if the only thing that was sent, if anything was sent, was the resources of police to lock them up and to beat them. And so we know what works. We just don't use it equally, and we don't apply it equally. And the question is, why don't we do that? And I think it's pretty clear why we don't do it. And we have to admit that so that we can fix it. So now we're talking about broken windows. A couple years ago, we were talking about stop, question, frisk. When we fix broken windows, we're going to be talking about whatever comes after that, unless we deal with the root of the problem in not just the NYPD, but the police departments across the country, which is based in their racial ethos and the way they believe and perceive these communities. That is what the problem is. And so this thing is working the way it's supposed to work. And so we have to jam that up, we have to admit what the problem is and address it. And so I think these communities have been intentionally ignored. And so I actually deal more with gun violence than I do with police reform, but the work I do in gun violence never makes the news. Only the police stuff does. But the places, so we started a national network to combat gun violence. And one of the things I want to do is get statistics from across the nation. When we have on dealing with council members and aldermen, depending on how they're called across the nation, because a lot of times they're the first people, if they're good aldermen, the first people dealing with the violence. But, I mean, you tend to see a pattern of the places that are dealing with the highest gun violence. They're also, usually, the statistics track the same. The unemployment, the housing, what's available, what's not available, the education, all in those same communities are similar. And we also know that. So now, why don't we fix those problems? And people always say that, well, these communities, they want more police. That's why we're sending more police. That is actually true. A lot of these communities request and want more police. And it's also trained, we're also trained to believe that that's the only thing that's going to work. But those same communities also cry out for their streets to be clean. They also cry out for a better educational system. I'm not even talking about what's taught. I'm talking about the building that they walk into that's overcrowded and that's falling apart, unless the side is a charter school side. That's another conversation. They also call for jobs just so that unemployment goes down. They also call for better paying jobs. So now we're seeing an economy that's going up. Jobs are being put into the economy, but it's all the low paying jobs. So we're feeling a slight benefit, but it's the low paying jobs. And so the benefit of having a job won't be as good as if your cycles of poverty generation. So why are those calls never answered? Why is the only call that's answered the police call? And that's a question that needs to be answered. So I always feel like public safety needs to be redefined. And police are part of public safety, but they're not public safety. They deal with law enforcement. And that's a partner that I believe is very much needed. But the other partners have been excluded from being a great part of the discussion. So here in the city, what I've tried to do is redirect that discussion, and we've had some measured discussion, some measured success, so that other agencies are involved when it comes to gun violence. Where has the Department of Mental Health been? Where has the Division of Youth and Community Development been? Where has the Department of Education been? So they're now being brought into that conversation. But it was wild a couple of years ago. I used to ask at the hearings of the city council. Back then we were only cutting programs. We were slashing everything. Bloomberg, that's a whole nother. But I would ask the DYCD commissioner, when we were slashing and burning all of their youth programs, have you spoken to the police commissioner about the effect this may have on the work that they're doing? And every year they would tell me no. So if you guys are not talking, that's a huge problem. You, the Department of Mental Health, should be looking at the same data that the NYPD is doing. So everybody could bring their resources and services to the community. Why is only one department responsible for this? And we saw some measured success for this I think in New York City. The crime went down in the nation in the 90s. A lot of people take credit for it. It did go a little further down in New York City. Giuliani takes credit for that. But Mayor Dinkins, right before he left, did two things. He did Safe Streets, Safe Cities. He did put some more police officers on the ground. But he did things like open the Beacon School. At the exact same time, I don't know if people remember Beacon Schools. They're not around as much as they used to. But many, many schools in the city became community centers for large parts of the day into the night, where young people came in and had a place, a safe place to stay, a safe place to do homework, safe place to have sports. That happened across the city. Now in my district, I don't even have a community center. The closest one is about 3 miles away. And one of my precincts has had one of the highest gun violence in the city. So we know what works. I'm going to be quiet now so that we can go to questions. But the question is, why are we not doing? I think we have enough research to show what works, what doesn't work. The question is, why are we not applying it? Why it's taking so long?
Okay. Thank you. I think it's important for scholars to also take some responsibility to try and make sense of their own research in terms of policy and strategy decisions. So my question to Todd and Geert is that, so what we've learned is that in lower disadvantaged neighborhoods, in places like Boston, in places like Trenton, prison lowers crime, but in higher disadvantaged neighborhoods, prison increases crime. But then in Newark, it's different. And it may be because in Newark, that levels of disadvantage, you reach a saturation point where things almost become so rigid they don't move anymore, which to me is a fascinating thing and has, as the panelists rightly said, big implications for many pockets of New York City. But the question is, so where do we go from here in understanding this, and how would this impact the strategies that we take?
So let me start by saying that we often talk about incarceration policy in the United States as though it's one story, because it's easy to tell one story. It's 40 years of growing prison populations, whether crime rates went up or down, whether the economy was good or bad, or at war and at peace, with increasing numbers of young men coming into the at-risk age groups, and then numbers dropping, and so on. So when we talk about that story, it's a good story. It's a good storyline, but it's actually not the truth, because the truth is there are 51 different incarceration policy stories out there, because incarceration policy is actually produced at the state level. And the MacArthur Foundation recently talking about looking at jails, one of the things you'll see is that we'll begin to understand better is that incarceration policy is actually produced at municipal levels as well. And I think our research suggests that it's actually produced at the neighborhood level. And we have, in that sense, we have a sample of 3. And nobody would want to make conclusions about the human race after talking to 3 humans. So I think it's I think what we've learned in our work, so in Tallahassee, I think we learned that incarceration rates matter for impoverished neighborhoods, and they produce problems for those neighborhoods. And we learned it partly because the research was quantitative, but in that work we did a lot of qualitative work as well. And one of the things that I was hearing here made me think that when we were interviewing people, residents of these communities, one of them said, if this was going on in a white community, it would never be allowed to happen. And so African Americans in these neighborhoods that have been affected by high rates of prison cycling have gotten it for a long time. And us sort of social scientists and people who are at arm's length from those places are finally beginning to get it. But it's not a new finding. That finding has been out there for 20 years for the people who've been experiencing it. But the problem is that the stories are very, very local. And so I think that also means very problematically that the solutions are also quite local. It's going to take social capital of the type that we just heard here, political capital of the type we just heard here. Now, I believe very much that there's an overarching story as well. If the United States tomorrow said we are going to go back to the prison policies of the sentencing policies of 1980, starting tomorrow, those are the sentencing policies. Within 5 years, we would have 1980s prison population. That's how simple it is. Now, getting there is very difficult. So there is an overarching story, but in terms of the impact on people, it is so place specific, and that I think we would be very. So I live and work. I work in Newark. I feel like I live there. I'm there so much. Newark is different. Newark's different than New York. Very different. It's different than any other place I've lived. So what happens in Newark is going to have to be Newark specific, and I think that'll be true. In neighborhoods in the Bronx and in neighborhoods in the Brooklyn and so forth. So I wish I could say there are 5 things you can do. I told you the big thing. But that's a takeaway, by the way. But the other things are really much more complicated, much more nuanced, and much more local.
Thank you.
Sure. Because to that point, which is very important, getting communities, different places to be involved in policing is immensely important. We don't do it. We have a cookie cutter policing procedure. But I try to speak to everybody, whether people agree with them or don't, because I find you can learn a lot from people. So I spent a lot of time speaking with George Kelling. People may boo. He created theory of broken windows. But 2 things that I learned is he admits that it doesn't have to be police that fix a broken window. So that was something that was made up after. And the second is that communities need to be involved in policing and what they see police should be focused on and not focused on, which sounds very progressive. If someone else said it, you would probably listen. So I listened when he said it because it made sense, and it's something that he just repeated. What the policing that we're doing in Newark may not be the same that we're doing in Brooklyn. East Flatbush, maybe in the Caribbean community, might be different than what we're going to focus on in Williamsburg, the Orthodox Jewish community, in Borough Park. So getting people involved in policing, in what they want police to focus on and how they want to police is actually very, very important. And I think when we talk about community policing and things of, which community policing is now a catchphrase for a lot of things, but when we talk about getting other folks involved in public safety, it's viewed as soft on crime. But nothing could be further from the truth. It's so much better on crime, and there's so many places that show that when communities get engaged in that way, it helps at a much better rate than what we're doing now. We have a community affairs unit in NYPD. That's not community police. In D.C., I spoke to Chief Lanier. She actually got rid of her community affairs unit, and everybody was tasked with doing that community work. And what happened there was they got other issues, but what happened there was the clearance rate went up. That means they were solving crimes more because the people were providing better information. And now if you have a community affairs unit that deal with community, then what are the other police supposed to do? That means that's not part of their job description, which I see as a problem. I'm happy that community affairs units are there, and they didn't get enough praise back in the day, but they're getting it now. But it should be immersed into the entire system.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll open up for any questions from the audience. You'd like to answer? Okay,
Sure,
please.
While we're waiting for
Sure.
questions from the audience and for the audience to come up to the microphones, I thought I would add one particular dimension. And if we want to talk about what we have to do about changing the incarceration rate, the way the criminal justice system works in this country right now, I think we have to keep in mind not just the local story, but also kind of a global story that has to do with and the way this global story works, particularly in the United States. So the 1970s or 1960s, when crime rate, when incarceration rates much lower, but partially has to do with sentencing and all those different things, but also we lived in a very kind of different economy. Right, here comes my economics department background. Right, the tax rates, for example, right, if you go back to the tax rates of the 1980, right, that would be very different. Right, if you have to keep in mind that there's a couple things that have happened. Right, one is the way race functions in the United States has shifted, and also there's a large change in the way the capitalism functions in the United States. So if you would look at graphs of exploding incarceration, if you would put a graph that you can change, you can keep the same graph almost, but change it to income inequality and all those different things. So it's not just incarceration, that's one part of the story, but there's lots of economic dimensions that have changed as well. So that I think those things have to be addressed as well, which is not just the local things, and it's the part of the massive growth of poverty, inequality, and so on since 1980 or so, right? And part of this, the prison populations exist and are so large in order to manage these populations that are left over behind in poverty and so on. So,
Julia?
I mean, I sit here nodding. I just want to throw something out there, and it's not measurable and probably intangible, and everybody will probably kick me out of here. But let's keep faith in the conversation. We have faith communities on every other block in some of these neighborhoods, and what better resource can our faith communities be than to be a hub, be that place where someone gets out and they can go to a church. I had a quick story. We were at another site, and churches want to be welcome, and many of the sacred books talk about welcoming the prisoner, et cetera, et cetera. And this one church said, we had some gang members coming in, and we were trying to do some gang intervention work, and they were really excited initially. And 6 months into the project, one of the church elders came to me and said, we want you to take the program elsewhere. I said, well, what's wrong? This is what we want to do. And they said, well, you got to understand, there's a lot of people, and some people aren't uncomfortable, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, okay, fine. I'm like, but it still doesn't make sense. And finally, the last thing they could come up with said, the concrete steps, these churches have these huge concrete steps that, lead to the big church doors. They said, the concrete steps are wearing down. And I knew I had lost, I was lost. There's some mental health stuff that goes beyond prison, that's undiagnosed. in some areas that we really need to look at. But again, I think I just want to throw out there that there's so many opportunities for us to be this hub where we can do some of this work. And I think that, and it's just a charge to the faith communities that what better place to do that than in those spaces.
Thank you. Okay, and we have our first question. If you could say very briefly who you are, and then tell us your question.
Certainly. My name is Michelle Knox. I am a work readiness instructor at the Hope program in Brooklyn. So what we do is we work with about half of our constituents are formerly incarcerated, also people who are in substance abuse programs and just having a hard time re-entering the workforce. We teach job readiness skills and then do employment services, so we help people get and keep jobs. So I'm looking at this from the perspective that we are doing our small part to help combat the effects that incarceration is having on the community. What you, as you said, Mr. Clear, this is information that we pretty much already knew organically. How could an organization like mine use your information when we are soliciting funding to help our funders understand that this is all tied in? Because we get it, I'm not so sure everybody else gets it.
I'll just say one of the problems I think is that all of the service providers have been put in competition with each other for a fixed pool of funds, and it is really problematic. I don't know the answer to your question. Let me just say two things that will be pretty unsatisfactory, I'm afraid. But one is that there is a movement afoot for a social impact bond framework. There's actually an experiment going on in New York. I'm on the board. And it has as its foundation that the private sector sets aside money for doing investments in socially prudent enterprise, can invest in structures like yours, and then the savings that the benefits you guys produce roll back to pay them back for their investment. There's complications here, there's plenty, but I think if we can create the size of scale of the small units right now that are forced to compete with each other for resources, but if we can bring them under an umbrella and start treating them as a collection of interventions and then start funding them through this social impact bond framework, I think we would have some ability to take this out of the government has to be involved, but it really, the money is not in the government, the money's in the private sector. And to the extent the private sector can see that by creating a better social foundation for business improves, that if these things actually produce savings that generate payback for those investments, it makes the whole story true. Now, there's plenty of problems with social impact bond framework. I don't want to minimize that, but I think it gives us the capacity to start thinking strategically about another way of funding that work.
Thank you. And Jamani, you'd like to speak to this too?
Sure. One, I just want to, somebody mentioned capitalism, and that's the one thing that worries me when I'm trying to do this, because capitalism benefits from a lower class. I mean, you have super rich because you have super poor. So I'm trying to figure out how much they actually, or how much this thing's actually going to work. And the only good thing about racism is you can look at me and see where I belong in the social strata. So that I'm easily identifiable of where I belong and what should happen to me. And so that's a problem I'm not necessarily sure how to fix. We got to keep pushing it, and we have to kind of change, I guess, what we believe is most important in life to try to deal with that. But with your direct question, the one thing I've tried to do, because I come from nonprofits, funders also put on nonprofits too much. You are forced to answer questions of how you're going to benefit an entire population. And so what I've been trying to figure out is how to make them understand that you cannot, the work that you do, even if you help 1,000 people, may not change the direction of the entire population. And so I'm hoping that nonprofits and funders will begin to change the conversation about what's asked. So my hope is that there's something called results-based accountability, RBA, that I've used to try to change how we answer some of the questions that they ask, performance measures, versus population indicators, so that it's more than just the work that you're doing, that they're forcing you to be responsible for the entire population.
Okay, and next question.
Hi, my name is Isabel New. I am a reporter from Columbia Journalism School, and I'm very interested in the topic of reentry and how it affects family. And I know our panelists today have talked about it, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on how families are affected financially, especially by, some people come out of prison with a lot of debt, child support arrears. So could you please talk about that?
Thank you. Kate, can you take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I think it's a lot of the things that you said, and I can't remember if it was who was citing the research on 40% less earning potential, or like 40% decrease in economic potential over time when you're incarcerated. So I think, there's so many, right? It's like from the destabilization of somebody, like I worked at a public defender office, so that very first moment of arrest of like, I was expecting my dad to come pick me up at school, but instead he was arrested for having a little bit of marijuana in his pocket. Like that, like that initial destabilization of, parents who call us totally frantic because they have no idea. Mothers who call completely frantic because she hasn't heard from her son in 3 days. And it's because he had a summons months ago that he never returned on for some ridiculous little thing, and then got stopped in like some kind of stop and frisk or whatever situation, and the warrant came up on the summons, and he ends up in central booking without even the 24-hour, the right to be seen in 24 hours because he had a warrant, right, because of the summons. So that's like the very beginning to people who, long sentences, the post-1980s, the sentences that we have now where people go away for years and years and years, and that affects their earning potential, and they come out with child support debt, even though they weren't able to earn any income or barely, any income while they were incarcerated. And, children, meanwhile, get removed and placed in foster care. Since 1996, just about any conviction for almost any crime makes you deportable, which has a huge impact on families when, breadwinners are facing deportation for like turnstile jumping, which happens, let alone drug convictions or anything more serious. I could sort of go on, but I think the impacts are pretty severe for families.
Thank you. Okay, next question.
I don't have a question. I have a comment.
Please.
William Stafford Jr., aka Mr. Rex. I was incarcerated under Robert Morgenthau, aka Freddy Krueger. In addition to him, I'm also going after his successor, Cyrus Vance, who's just as bad as him, and Robert Johnson, whose home address is 84 Beach Street Lane in Pelham, not Bronx Island, aka Bronx, according to USPS.com. So therefore, he's disqualified to be my board prosecutor, my illegitimate board prosecutor. Just to keep you informed.
Thank you. Yeah.
I have to leave. I'm very sorry. I have to go teach. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Hey guys, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Jasleen Villamel. I'm in a Pinkerton Fellowship. And so basically I agree with all you guys on the community involvement, and I'm so happy to hear. I interned with you guys in the Bronx Defenders, and I was in love with your work and the interdisciplinary model. So I just want to give props to that. I know those stories that you told that are just so sad. But I did have a question. So when Jamani, when you mentioned about the community affairs thing in Washington, D.C., and how when it was taken away and that the police actually had a role, they tried to do that here in in the city, I believe. They're trying to make the police more involved with the community, right? I don't know exactly too much about that, but I just wanted to wonder, like, how do you think the police dynamic in the community would be when right now we're based on fear? Like, how would it look to you if the police weren't based on fear? Is that even possible in the city? I just wanted more information on that.
I think anything is possible. How probable? I'm not sure. In the near future, they have a bunch of pilot programs that they're doing now. That's being called community policing. I'm not 100% sure that it is community policing. I do like some of the things that I've heard, but I'm not sure how it's. My thing is, I'm not sure how it's impacting the police officer that's not a part of this special program. That is going to interact with people day to day. If they're not bought into the ethos of a different model of policing, then their interaction is not going to be different. In the model that I've accepted as policing, police officers become more problem solvers. So if there is a problem, the first tool is not an arrest or summons. It's trying to fix the problem. Like, you have access to other people that can help that person, that family, that block deal with whatever issue it is. So that arrest and summons and introducing someone to the criminal justice system is not the first thing that happens. And I don't think that's what the NYPD has. It would be great if they're headed in that direction, which they say they are. But what I'm worried about is, even though I like the pilot programs, I'm worried about that if folks adopt community policing, but haven't changed the methodology of how police are interacting every day. And so we have the community affairs units. A lot of them are great, actually, and they've been underappreciated for quite some time. But it needs to be. Community policing is not a beat cop. It's not a special program. It's an adoption of a philosophy from the commissioner down to the officer who walks the street every day. I don't think that has happened. I think we're a while away from that, and I think it takes some time. Although they've said that that's the direction they want to go, I'm not sure, and I'm worried about the co-option of that word, community policing, that we're going to be chasing. But it would be great to see it happen. I do think it's possible. I think it happened in other places. Obviously, New York is different. This is the 7th largest army in the world, about 34,000 police officers. So it is very different, and it takes a while for people to accept it. So one of the problems is us voting in elected officials who say they'll be tough on crime by arresting people. And then that gives power to us to bring in people who will have a different philosophy. So we also have to believe and understand that that is not the methodology that works.
Can I just add something really quick to that? I think there's the sort of this, like, the baseline of policing, right, should be do no harm. And there's a really compelling parallel with the research, which is that incarceration, it turns out, at least in some localities, like, makes things worse. Like, it makes things worse in a lot of ways, but it even makes crime worse. And I think we don't have the research on it, but I would hypothesize that policing has the same effect in a lot of places because of exactly what Councilman Williams is describing. And so, I think there's all of those programs and pilots and models. They're all great. I'm happy to see all of them, but just to echo him, like, you have to, like, we don't significantly reduce overall just criminal justice contact for people, especially Black and Latino people, young people, in communities of, like, it's just not going to work. None of those pilot programs is going to make that, is going to make the change that we need to see if we don't have that broader scale change.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so we're also emphasizing here that it's important to not simply as an alternative to incarceration have a system of fines that drives people further into the system, but we're talking about trying to have a problem-solving dialogue where police, community together solve the problems that they face. Okay, next question.
Good morning. My name is Banapsha. I'm also a Pinkerton Fellow, and I'm currently placed at Exalt, which is a small nonprofit organization working with court-involved youth. I actually have two questions. My first one kind of tags off of what Jessalyn already mentioned, and I was wondering if the community is involved in policing, do you think it will lead to more distrust and disunity in the sense that they might feel like they're snitching on somebody that, is drug dealing or involved in some criminal activity?
That's me. The one of the problems that people have said of community policing was that people, the only critique I've really heard was that they're worried that the community would forgive too many. But that hasn't happened. I've seen in the miles that I've seen. Snitching is a whole different thing. I think the people that live by that snitching code are not the people who are probably going to give that information. But there are a lot of people who actually want to give information and look to give information, but don't trust the police to give that information. Also, I always want to be careful when we talk about snitching because it's called something here, but someplace else it's the same thing. You have the blue wall of silence in the police department that often doesn't get talked about when you talk about snitching. They try to pretend it's not an actual human thing that people think. But many of us that are actually working on the gun violence stuff is trying to change what people perceive snitching to be because people are confused. So if you and I commit a crime and I get caught and I'm telling you that may be a case of snitching. If a grandmother is looking out the window and sees somebody's head get blown off, that's not snitching. That's self-preservation of a community. And I think people have confused the two. And there's been an effort from credible messengers who have been in that life to really try to change the definition of snitching because they're trying to force communities to be afraid of self-preserving themselves. But I don't think that will be as big of a problem as people think. And in D.C., the opposite happened.
Thank you. And my second question is for Mr. Clear. When we were talking about Newark, you said that there's a high degree of concentration there of crime and incarceration. I was wondering if that was because of over-policing in those areas?
No, I don't think Newark is over-policed, although the Newark Police Department is under consent decree right now because of the nature of the policing that's been done there and the same issues that we've been talking about. The Justice Department found to be legally to raise the level of unconstitutional treatment of citizens there. No, Newark recently reduced its police department by 300 uniformed officers because of financial problems, fiscal issues. There's a very problematic economic infrastructure for the city of Newark. There's a lot of people making money on Newark. Most of them who make the money on Newark don't live in Newark. And so the money that Newark generates leaves Newark very quickly. Prudential is there. Panasonic is there. So what those of us who care about Newark are trying to do is to find ways of increasing economic activity. Every time a dollar changes hands in Newark, it's $2 of economic value for Newark. But what happens is that people make Newark money working in Newark. They go home to Montclair and spend it. So, and I think the policing problem is similar in that these neighborhoods. So people in Newark feel under-policed in the sense that they feel underprotected, and they feel over-policed in the sense that they feel that their young men are under inappropriate surveillance. And it doesn't sound like that's a story that can go together until you live it, and you can see how it does go together.
But by the way, those are people. I get a lot of flack right now because I'm part of the city council that's proposing 1,000 new officers. There's several reasons why I'm doing that. I don't think it changes. Out of 34,000, I don't think it changes how good or bad the department's going to be. But the thing that he said is just true. There are communities that at the same time ask for additional officers and are pissed that their sons and nephews are stopped, questioned, and frisked and don't want to be abused. And so that is a very true thing that is in the minds of people who live in this.
I'll say one more thing. So 911 calls, what arises to an emergency that gets an immediate response in Newark, you would be surprised to know. So that people call 911, they got something going on, they're reporting a car is being broken into by somebody outside their house, and they are watching it happen. That's not an immediate response to emergency because of the level. So Newark is under-policed at the same time that it's over-policed.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, how are you? Thank you again for coming. Baseline thing we should all say. My name is Spencer. I work at Advocates for Children, so I kind of work on the other end of it before they get to the criminal justice arena. I'm trying to stop that before that happens. Advocates for children. What I have is back to the research. Why is crime and blackness mitigating factors in the research? Because to bring it back to New York City, I live in Jamaica, Queens. It's a stable community, like financially, but it's also the highest stop and frisk rate out there when it was big. Like a very high volume of policing out there. And where is the crime? There's not a lot of crime rate. So why is blackness such a mitigating factor in these places where poverty is not exactly there existing, or these other leading to actual crimes are not actually being policed? So.
I'll just say I think it's the numbers speak for themselves. Underlying all of this conversation is a poorly discussed issue of race, and I don't think we have appropriately confronted the implications of it, multi-generational, cultural, and economic. So you'll see that what sets Newark apart is how black it is, and so that means something. And I don't think we are very good at saying what that means, just as I don't think we're particularly well finely tuned about knowing what that means. But clearly, a legacy of racism is at the roots, and therefore ending the implications of a legacy of racism is a core part of the solution. I think Michelle Alexander got it right.
I think that's right. So poverty in economics is a big one, definitely. But always underlying everything is race. I can't remember the years exactly, but I think it was 2008 to 2011 or 2003 to 2011 when they did a study of bicycle on sidewalk stop. And in Park Slope, there was about 8 per year citations. In East New York, there was about 1,400 a year. In Bed-Stuy, it was over 2,000 a year. And I believe that white people ride bicycles on sidewalks. That's just a hunch. And so there's only certain differences in those communities. And so you can't get away from it as much as people try to bring it up and people push back. And so there are 2 things that I think are reasons why people push back. One is I think when you talk about the systemic and systematic problems with racism in the structure, some people feel you're calling them a racist. And so we have to get away from that. No individual person is a racist because this system and structure exists. It just exists. It's a matter of fact. And so pretending that it doesn't exist is a problem. And then I think people are trying to say you're trying to make an excuse as opposed to dealing with personal responsibility, where this problem with institutional racism and personal responsibility intersect. They're not separate. And so I think we have to get those 2 things out, and so people can feel more comfortable. Just because, I happen to be, I always say black for most of my life, but just because, I'm black and someone's white, you don't have to feel like, I'm a racist because the system is the way it is. It's just the way it is. The only thing that helps is just admitting that's where it is and helping for it to get better, and allowing people to say, okay, this system is problematic, but I also have my own personal responsibility. Those 2 things can go together and have to go together. But I think that's the only reason I could think of, except for people just wanted to continue. But other than that, I think those are the reasons that people have a knee-jerk reaction when they hear these things.
Thank you. So I think we're going to have time for just 2 more quick questions. Okay.
How you doing, Kevin? Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. So Ronald Dave, the Associate Vice President for the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society, and also a 3rd-year criminal justice doctoral student, CUNY Graduate Center / John Jay. So my question is about, I've recently read an article by Michael Tarnry and also one by Jeremy Travis in Criminology and Public Policy, and both talk about remodeling American sentencing. And so we've been talking about the optimism that exists around our criminal justice system and a shift in the pendulum. Tarnry kind of says we might be a little ahead of ourselves because the sentencing laws that got us into this problem in the first place have been changed minimally. And so very, very few of the harsh sentencing laws, life without parole now, 50,000 people serving those sentences, the mandatory minimums, Rockefeller drug laws, all these different sentencing laws. So he makes that point, and he's saying again, minimal changes have been made. The other thing is that the changes that have occurred have been mostly from the judiciary, not from the legislature. So the question is, how do we move the legislature to change that? Because oftentimes they're influenced by their constituents, and the perception of crime among blacks is what's driving a lot of the punitive sentencing to begin with. The other thing that I would just ask quickly also is, we have not really began talking about the harshness of the sentencing. So he makes the point, and I'll read it briefly, is that lengths of prison sentences in the United States are extraordinarily long compared with those in other Western countries. Sentences longer than 1 year are uncommon in most. Longer than 3 years, very uncommon. And longer than 5 years, rare. So the maximum sentences that can be imposed, usually for a single offense in these Western countries, usually 12 to 20 years. We give a person 50 years, 75 years, 100 years, totally not thinking about the research associated with desistance and so forth. So my question is, how do we change mass incarceration without dealing with those specific issues?
You cannot. And I want to say that one of the concerns I have is that we spend a lot of our time talking about very important things that have nothing to do with mass incarceration. So they are, I don't like to see a contest between two organizations trying to meet needs. I don't like to see a contest between conversations about justice reform. But I will say this, that I think it's very clear that the issue of reentry has very little to do with mass incarceration. You can't reenter from prison until you've gone there. The issue of innocence, as important as it is, has nothing to do with mass incarceration. Not nothing, but almost nothing. Death penalty, on and on and on. If we don't figure out how to talk about people who are convicted of violent crimes in a different way and handle them in a different way, we will not solve this problem.
And I'm sorry, I have to head out as well. But one thing I said before, it's about us also, because we don't respond, or we haven't been responding to people who want to put programs in place that actually work or talk about resentencing. We elect the people who talk about longer prison sentences and arresting more people. So we have to understand, even in, like you said, but even in many of our communities, we believe that that is the way to do it, and that's problematic. And I got to put a plug in for the Fair Chance Act that we're trying to get passed in the City Council, which would change when people ask about your criminal record. Well, it's commonly called ban the box, in which people, you check off I've been arrested or whatever, and they throw it in the garbage. And now we're making it so that you can't ask that question until you offer them a job. And the thinking that most people go to is, well, what about a murderer? And actually, murderers have the lowest recidivism rate of any crime. And so it's the thought process that people hang on to. This stuff doesn't work, but they innately, for some reason, believe that it is, particularly if it's only black and brown people who are affected. So we just really, the sentencing part is tremendously important. You talked about the Rockefeller drug laws, but you look at any sentencing guideline. Black people are more likely to get a harsher crime sentence than an equitable crime for a white person. So racism in that even is a problem. But I'm sorry, I have to go, and I see you kicking me off the mic. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And very quickly.
Hi. My name is Marilyn Alvarado. I'm currently a Pinkerton Community Fellow as well. I work with cases. I work with the kids who are in the post-tech session, so I work with those. My question is, Mr. Williams talking about history, and a lot of people aren't exposed to that due to just how the system is set up, such as the Black Panthers movement, which was very heavily involved with youth, as well as like La Raza Unida. So my question would be what would be your advice for the upcoming generation, such as my fellows and such as the people about to graduate college, who want to advocate for these issues and just don't know how to go about it?
Jose?
We have one of your fellows too, actually, at Exodus, Maliki. And I think one of the things she does is it's just so wonderful in how you guys engaged in the process. And I think part of that engagement now has provided some tools so us to be able to go out to the community now. And in small pockets, this doesn't have to be mass change tomorrow, but in small pockets, how do we begin to bring a consciousness to other people who feel they are removed because it doesn't affect them directly. And I think when you talk about those indirect consequences to the community, people begin to wake up. People begin to get it. People begin to say, wow, someone is in prison for 2 ounces of cocaine and falls under the LWOP laws and has life without parole, plus 30 years. So when he dies, he comes back and has to do 30 years. I mean, these are some of the sentencing guidelines that exist. So I think if you begin to talk about a consciousness-raising movement amongst all Pinkerton Fellows, because it has begun, and take what you learn with you, and it starts right at home, family, community. I think that's the first step in at least beginning to become agents of change in the community.
Kate, very quickly.
Just really quickly, I mean, so Councilman Williams just left, but like, we need more elected officials like him at every single level, right? Like city council, federal, state. And so I would say one thing is like build political power. And that doesn't, there's a lot, everyone goes to law school and becomes lawyers, but like think about whether it's part of your job or part of just the work you do in the community outside of your job. Think about how to build political power so that we can elect people who will change the sentencing laws that need to be changed for us to change mass incarceration.
And hold on, because it's happening now. Your generation is going to do it. My generation gave you a big problem. Your generation gets to solve it, and it's happening now.
Okay, we'd like to thank you very much for coming. From here, Anne?
I just was going to say, let's give them all a hand, including Kevin, Julio, Kate, Todd, Geert, and Councilmember Williams. Thank you so much. And thank all of you for coming too.